Perhaps one of the most beloved passages from the Old Testament, particularly from the Psalms, is the 23rd Psalm, in which David writes about the Lord being his shepherd. It's very natural for David to have written about that because he had spent the earliest part of his life tending sheep and being a shepherd himself. And so he could identify with this very much. And yet he wrote a passage that would speak not only to that generation then and to his own heart personally, but would continue to speak for generations and generations to come, and even to us today. And as we think about a son of David, Jesus, some almost 1,000 years after David had initially written the 23rd Psalm, Jesus identifies himself with this idea of being a shepherd. Jesus, from what we understand, grew up as a carpenter's son and apparently practiced that to some extent in his life, but he never identifies himself as a carpenter, but he does identify himself, at least in John chapter 10, as a shepherd. In fact, he uses an illustration in the first 5 verses, and it's called an illustration by some translations. Some call it a parable, some call it a figure of speech. And yet, whatever the idea that expressed here is Jesus using this analogy and this idea of being a shepherd to say, as he does in verse 1, "Truly I say to you, he who does not enter by the sheepfold, by the door, but climbs in another way, that man is a thief and a robber. But he who enters by the door is the shepherd of the sheep." And he will make that statement a little later in verse 11 in the same chapter, that I'm the good shepherd. But before he does that, he talks a little more about the sheepfold itself. And when you continue on in verse 7, he says, "Truly, truly, I say to you, I am the door of the sheep." And so another one of these I am sayings of Jesus, I am the door to the sheep. In fact, he'll repeat it in verse 9, that he is the door to the sheep. And when he says this, he harkens back to the illustration that he uses, that the ones who came before were thieves and robbers, but he's really the one who's the door to the sheep. So in this text, he calls himself the shepherd. He uses the analogy of being a shepherd in the sheepfold, but he also calls himself the door to the sheep. And when he uses it that second time, he says, "If anyone enters by me," and that's really what we use a door for, isn't it? For a point of access. And he says, "If you enter by me into that sheepfold, you will be saved and go out and find pasture." In other words, going through Jesus as the door, sort of similar to another I am saying that we'll look at later in John 14, when he says that I am the way. But when we think about Jesus being the door to the sheepfold and the door for the sheep, when we enter that door through Jesus, we find salvation. And it is through that door we have access to salvation. We hear, we believe the gospel, we obey the gospel, and we become a sheep of Jesus, and Jesus as our shepherd. So let's strive to enter the door that leads us to eternal life.